Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, host, Fragath, and today we're going to keep reading from Oceanic, the short story collection by the inestimable Greg Egan. This week we're going to be doing two short stories, which is going to involve me skipping over one, which we'll get to when I come back next. Provided I remember, which is probably not going to happen. Um, so, an update. I'm not going to be here next week. Next week is out. I was hoping I would still have Free Read Fridays, but unfortunately that got taken away due to complications. The less said, the better. So this week we're going to be reading the short story Border Guards, which is sports in the future, and through the lens of Greg Egan, and Glory, and I don't remember what that one's about at all. I think it has something to do with space, possibly. Possibly there's some space. Anyway, I just lost my page. Good work. Give me a minute here. Anyway, uh, Border Guards is going to be like classic modern Egan, and in listening and reading this, this is what you can largely expect from a bunch of his more recent works, where he takes basically a bunch of people's mundane life in a fantastical setting with fantastical rules, and then gives it to you in about as flat an affect as possible. So part of it's kind of boring, and part of it's like, wow, okay, that's pretty wild. And I'm going to leave it up to you to decide which it is. The delivery can be a bit flat. Um, I'm not going to do much to spice it up, but suffice it to say, I love modern Egan because he's doing wild things like this. But sometimes I think he could try embracing the craziness of what he's doing a little more, which is what he did in Dichronauts, for what it's worth. It was kind of my main complaint with the Arrow of Time trilogy is as cool as the ideas there were, he's expecting the ideas to carry the story, and um, you'd think you couldn't make, you couldn't, let's parse this properly. Uh, a story about extra-dimensional space aliens who decide we're going to launch a rocket so that we can go back in time to see the future, to see the past, to come up with a solution to fix our present. You'd think that would be very difficult to make boring. Wow, I think I actually got that right too when I mumbled that. That was stream of consciousness, and I think that's fairly close to what they did. It's been a few years. Anyway, the Arrow of Time trilogy is quite good, or Clockwork Rocket trilogy is quite good. I highly recommend it, but there are definitely parts of those books where you're kind of like, okay, why are we here? Um, and it's like it gets into, okay, it's a big long-term space mission, and you're having to deal with like generation ship problems, but using an entirely different series of laws of physics from what we humans are accustomed to. Um, and sometimes it's easy to lose. Also, there's graphs. There's like lots of graphs and charts. So it's like it's easy to be like scratching your head, being like, I don't know if I have big enough brain for this. Please help. Dichronauts, on the other hand, is a bit more of an actual, feels more adventure-y, while also still being like, well, these people are just living their life. It's perfectly normal for them. Of course, they're not going to think much of such and such. But he does a good job of exaggerating certain things in such a way so that it's like, oh, well, while this is a weird thing, while this isn't a weird thing for them, this is a situation which makes it surprising. Um, and then, goes way off from there. It's excellent. It's very hard to describe Dichronauts. Um, Suffice to say, people living in like they're not flatlanders. They're living in a universe or dimension of drastically reduced or drastically different dimensions than we're accustomed to. Like you can move forward, backward, left, and right, but if you try to turn on your axis, things get weird. So it's like two civilizations, two races of people um, who live in symbiosis. Basically, there's critters that crawl into this one species' head and helps provide them direction from other uh, axes and vectors, so that they know what's going on to their left and right or forward and back, as the case may be. But you can't rotate. So from that humble premise, he's then like, well, let's extrapolate from there. And it gets wild. They're very good. I do definitely want to read Dichronauts at some point on stream because I think it's quite worth reading, and it's a fairly interesting read. The Arrow of Time. I keep slurring my words when I say that. The Arrow of Time trilogy is mostly it's 3 books and it's kind of daunting, but after I get through the Hyperion Cantos, very little is going to seem daunting anymore. So it'll be a good time. So yeah, we're doing Border Guards and Glory, um, today. And basically, if you wind up liking Border Guards and what the short story Border Guards has to offer, highly recommend checking out Dichronauts or the Clockwork Rocket trilogy. That'd be a good idea. So right now, because I'm not going to be here next week, this is pre-game ramble. I try not to do too much of that. I'm fairly sure I'll be able to do it the week after. If I am not able to do it the week after, I will reassess and figure it out. I'll move days around. It's going to be tough for me to establish how I'm going to do that because I don't do the social media thing. But I'll try and get it out there. To people who are listening to these all after the fact, this is obviously not a problem for any of you to worry about. This is past timeline frag being like, well, here's a problem coming up in future timeline frag, and his continuum and his eigenstate, and he's going to have to make certain decisions and tweak his eigenstates accordingly, or something. Where was I? Oh, right. Yeah. So this, I'm expecting another. Oh, geez, it's gonna be like 3 streams out of this minimum after today. Uh, yeah, 3 streams. So it'll be today. It'll be the week after next, hopefully. The week after that, and then the week after that, and we should be done with Oceanic at that point. Um, and then we will start the Hyperion Cantos. All right, that's my blather over. It's been 15 minutes, so my apologies. We'll get cracking right now. This is a solid, I don't know, 60 pages worth of reading I've got to do now or so. So we're going to bang it out. Okie doke. Give me a moment here to get some water in me, and we'll get rocking and rolling on this crazy roller coaster. Border Guards by Greg Egan. In the early afternoon of his 4th day out of sadness, Jamil was wandering home from the gardens at the center of Nether, Noether, Nether, when he heard shouts from the playing field behind the library. On the spur of the moment, without even asking the city what game was in progress, he decided to join in. As he rounded the corner and the field came into view, it was clear from the movements of the players that they were in the middle of a quantum soccer match. At Jamil's request, the city painted the wave function of the hypothetical ball across his vision, and tweaked him to recognize the players as the members of two teams without changing their appearance at all. Maria had once told him that she always chose a literal perception of color-coded clothing instead. She had no desire to use pathways that had evolved for the sake of sorting people into those you defended and those you slaughtered. But almost everything that had been bequeathed to them was stained with blood, and to Jamil it seemed a far sweeter victory to adapt the worst relics to his own ends than to discard them as irretrievably tainted. I can reread that sentence in a way that makes a bit more syntactical and contextual sense. Maria had, okay, it's actually half a paragraph. Maria had once told him that she always chose a literal perception of color-coded clothing instead. She had no desire to use pathways that had evolved for the sake of sorting people into those you defended and those you slaughtered. But almost everything that had been bequeathed to them was stained with blood. So anyway, they're saying that basically humankind evolved in a brutal, murderous fashion, and so there. And Jamil is like, well, hey, we're going to. And to Jamil, it seemed a far sweeter victory to adapt the worst relics to his own ends than to discard them as irretrievably tainted. But almost everything that had been bequeathed to them was stained with blood, and to Jamil it seemed a far sweeter victory to adapt their worst relics to his own ends than to discard them as irretrievably tainted. There we go. That's a tough one to read. I know what it means. Expressing that isn't easy. Sorry about that. We got caught in a little feedback loop there. Uh, we try not to get caught in those too often. Sorry. The wave function appeared as a vivid auroral light, a quicksilver plasma bright enough to be distinct in the afternoon sunlight, yet unable to dazzle the eye or conceal the players running through it. Bands of color representing the complex phase of the wave swept across the field, parting to wash over separate rising lobes of probability before hitting the boundary and bouncing back again, inverted. The match was being played by the oldest, simplest rules, semi-classical, non-relativistic. The ball was confined to the field by an infinitely high barrier, so there was no question of it tunneling out, leaking away as the match progressed. The players were treated classically. Their movements pumped energy into the wave, enabling transitions from the game's opening state, with the ball spread thinly across the entire field, into the range of higher energy modes needed to localize it. But localization was fleeting. There was no point forming a nice sharp wave packet in the middle of the field in the hope of kicking it around like a classical object. You had to shape the wave in such a way that all of its modes, cycling at different frequencies, traveling with different velocities, that's modes with a capital M as in Mary. Sorry. Lowercase m as in Mary. Sorry, not a capital M. In such a way that all of its modes, cycling at different frequencies, traveling with different velocities, would come into phase with each other for a fraction of a second within the goal itself. Achieving that was a matter of energy levels and timing. Jamil had noticed that one team was under strength. The umpire would be skewing the field's potential to keep the match fair, but a new participant would be especially welcome for the sake of restoring symmetry. He watched the faces of the players, most of them old friends. They were frowning with concentration, but breaking now and then into smiles of delight at their small successes or their opponent's ingenuity. He was badly out of practice, but if he turned out to be dead weight, he could always withdraw. And if he misjudged his skills and lost the match with his incompetence, no one would care. The score was 0-all. He could wait for a goal, but that might be an hour or more in coming. Jamil communed with the umpire and discovered that the players had decided in advance to allow new entries at any time. Before he could change his mind, he announced himself. The wave froze, and he ran onto the field. People shouted greetings, mostly making no fuss, though Ezekiel shouted, "Welcome back!" Jamil suddenly felt fragile again. Though he'd ended his long seclusion 4 days before, it was well within his power, still, to be dismayed by everything the game would involve. His recovery felt like a finely balanced optical illusion, a figure and ground that could change roles in an instant, a solid cube that could evert into a hollow. The umpire guided him to his allotted starting position, opposite a woman he hadn't seen before. He offered her a formal bow, and she returned the gesture. This was no time for introductions, but he asked the city if she'd published a name. She had. Margit. The umpire counted down in their heads. Jamil tensed, regretting his impulsiveness. For 7 years he'd been dead to the world. After 4 days back, what was he good for? His muscles were incapable of atrophy, his reflexes could never be dulled, but he'd chosen to live with an unconstrained will, and at any moment his wavering resolve could desert him. The umpire said, "Play!" The frozen light around Jamil came to life, and he sprang into motion. Each player was responsible for a set of modes, particular harmonics of the wave that were theirs to fill, guard, or deplete as necessary. Jamil's 12 modes cycled at between 1000 and 1250 millihertz. The rules of the game endowed his body with a small, fixed potential energy, which repelled the ball slightly and allowed different modes to push and pull on each other through him. But if he stayed in one spot as the modes cycled, every influence he exerted would eventually be replaced by its opposite, and the effect would simply cancel itself out. To drive the wave from one mode to another, you needed to move, and to drive it efficiently, you needed to exploit the way the modes fell in and out of phase with each other. To take from a 1000 millihertz mode and give it to a 1250, you had to act in sync with the quarter hertz beat between them. It was like pushing a child's swing at its natural frequency. But rather than setting a single child in motion, you were standing between two swings and acting more as an intermediary, trying to time your interventions in such a way as to speed up one child at the other's expense. The way you pushed on the wave at a given time and place was out of your hands completely, but by changing location in just the right way, you could gain control over the interaction. Every pair of modes had a spatial beat between them, like the moire pattern formed by two sheets of woven fabric held up to the light together, shifting from transparent to opaque as the gaps between the threads fell in and out of alignment. Slicing through this cyclic landscape offered the perfect means to match the accompanying chronological beat. Jamil sprinted across the field at a speed and angle calculated to drive two favorable transitions at once. He'd gauged the current spectrum of the wave instinctively, watching from the sidelines, and he knew which of the modes in his charge would contribute to a goal and which would detract from the probability. As he cut through the shimmering bands of color, the umpire gave him tactile feedback to supplement his visual estimates and calculations, allowing him to sense the difference between a cyclic tug, a to and fro that came to nothing, and the gentle but persistent force that meant he was successfully riding the beat. Chusak called out to him urgently, "Take! Take! 210!" Everyone's spectral territory overlapped with someone else's, and you needed to pass amplitude from player to player as well as trying to manage it within your own range. 210, a harmonic with two peaks across the width of the field and 10 along its length, cycling at 1160 millihertz, was filling up as Chusak drove unwanted amplitude from various lower energy modes into it. It was Jamil's role to empty it, putting the amplitude somewhere useful. Any mode with an even number of peaks across the field was unfavorable for scoring, because it had a node with a lowercase n, as in Nancy. A 0 point between the peaks, smack in the middle of both goals. The only reason I mention the n versus the m is that doesn't always translate super well over the reading equipment I'm using, which is a headset. I do not have a professional microphone. Gee, Frag, I wonder if they noticed that the sound quality wasn't up to studio par. Gosh, who'd have thunk? Anyway, I try. I try to enunciate clearly, using the M's and the N's, making them clear, but it's not always. Anyway, where were we? Any mode with an even number of peaks across the field was unfavorable for scoring, because it had a node, a 0 point between the peaks, smack in the middle of both goals. Jamil acknowledged the request with a hand signal and shifted his trajectory. It was almost a decade since he'd last played the game, but he still knew the intricate web of possibilities by heart. He could drain the 210 harmonic into the 310, 5-2, and 5-6 modes, all with good parity, peaks along the center line, in a single action. As he pounded across the grass, carefully judging the correct angle by sight, increasing his speed until he felt the destructive beats give way to a steady force like a constant breeze, he suddenly recalled a time, centuries before, in another city, when he'd played with one team, week after week, for 40 years. Faces and voices swam in his head. Hashim, Jamil's 98th child, and Hashim's granddaughter, Lila, had played beside him. But he'd burned his house and moved on, and when that era touched him at all now, it was like an unexpected gift. The scent of the grass, the shouts of the players, the soles of his feet striking the ground, resonated with every other moment he'd spent the same way, bridging the centuries, binding his life together. He never truly felt the scale of it when he sought it out deliberately. It was always small things, tightly focused moments like this, that burst the horizon of his everyday concerns and confronted him with the astonishing vista. The 210 mode was draining faster than he'd expected. The see-sawing center line dip in the wave was vanishing before his eyes. He looked around and saw Margit performing an elaborate lissajou maneuver, smoothly orchestrating a dozen transitions at once. Jamil froze and watched her, admiring her virtuosity while he tried to decide what to do next. There was no point competing with her when she was doing such a good job of completing the task Chuseok had set him. Margit was his opponent, but they were both aiming for exactly the same kind of spectrum. The symmetry of the field meant that any scoring wave would work equally well for either side, but only one team could be the first to reap the benefit, the first to have more than half the wave's probability packed into their goal. So the two teams were obliged to cooperate at first, and it was only as the wave took shape from their combined efforts that it gradually became apparent which side would gain by sculpting it to perfection as rapidly as possible, and which would gain by spoiling it for the first chance, then honing it for the rebound. Penina chided him over her shoulder as she jogged past. "You want to leave her to clean up 4-6 as well?" She was smiling, but Jamil was stung. He'd been motionless for 10 or 15 seconds. It was not forbidden to drag your feet and rely on your opponents to do all the work, but it was regarded as a shamefully impoverished strategy. It was also very risky, handing them the opportunity to set up a wave that was almost impossible to exploit yourself. He reassessed the spectrum and quickly sorted through the alternatives. Whatever he did would have unwanted side effects. There was no magic way to avoid influencing modes in other players' territory, and any action that would drive the transitions he needed would also trigger a multitude of others, up and down the spectrum. Finally, he made a choice that would weaken the offending mode while causing as little disruption as possible. Jamil immersed himself in the game, planning each transition 2 steps in advance, switching strategy halfway through a run if he had to, but staying in motion until the sweat dripped from his body, until his calves burned, until his blood sang. He wasn't blinded to the raw pleasures of the moment, or to memories of games past, but he let them wash over him, like the breeze that rose up and cooled his skin with no need for acknowledgment. Familiar voices shouted terse commands at him. As the wave came closer to a scoring spectrum, every trace of superfluous conversation vanished. Every idle glance gave way to frantic, purposeful gestures. To a bystander, this might have seemed like the height of dehumanization. 22 people reduced to grunting cogs in a pointless machine. Jamil smiled at the thought, but refused to be distracted into a complicated imaginary rebuttal. Every step he took was the answer to that. Every hoarse plea to Yan or Joracy, Chusak or Maria, Eudor or Halide. Halliday? These were his friends, and he was back among them. Back in the world. The first chance of a goal was 30 seconds away, and the opportunity would fall to Jamil's team. A few tiny shifts in amplitude would clinch it. Margit kept her distance, but Jamil could sense her eyes on him constantly, and literally feel her at work through his skin as she slackened his contact with the wave. In theory, by mirroring your opponent's movements at the correct position on the field, you could undermine everything they did, though in practice, not even the most skillful team could keep the spectrum completely frozen. Going further and spoiling it and going further and spoiling was a tug of war you didn't want to win too well. If you degraded the wave too much, your opponent's task, spoiling your own subsequent chance at a goal, became far easier. Jamil still had two bad parity modes that he was hoping to weaken, but every time he changed velocity to try a new transition, Margit responded in an instant, blocking him. He gestured to Chusak for help. Chusak had his own problems with Ezekiel, but he could still make trouble for Margit by choosing where he placed unwanted amplitude. Jamil shook sweat out of his eyes. He could see the characteristic stepping stone patterns of lobes forming, a sign that the wave would soon converge on the goal. But from the middle of the field it was impossible to judge their shape accurately enough to know what, if anything, remained to be done. Suddenly, Jamil felt the wave push against him. He didn't waste time looking around for Margit. Chusak must have succeeded in distracting her. He was almost at the boundary line, but he managed to reverse smoothly, continuing to drive both the transitions he'd been aiming for. Two long lobes of probability, each modulated by a series of oscillating mounds, raced along the sides of the field. A third, shorter lobe running along the center line melted away, reappeared, then merged with the others as they touched the end of the field, forming an almost rectangular plateau encompassing the goal. The plateau became a pillar of light, growing narrower and higher as dozens of modes, all finally in phase, crashed together against the impenetrable barrier of the field's boundary. A shallow residue was still spread across the entire field, and a diminishing sequence of elliptical lobes trailed away from the goal like a staircase, but most of the wave that had started out lapping around their waists was now concentrated in a single peak that towered above their heads, 9 or 10 meters tall. For an instant, it was motionless. Then it began to fall. The umpire said, 49.8. The wave packet had not been tight enough. Jamil struggled to shrug off his disappointment and throw his instincts into reverse. The other team had 50 seconds now to fine-tune the spectrum and ensure that the reflected packet was just a fraction narrower when it reformed, at the opposite end of the field. As the pillar collapsed, replaying its synthesis in reverse, Jamil caught sight of Margit. She smiled at him calmly, and it suddenly struck him. She'd known they couldn't make the goal. That was why she'd stopped opposing him. She'd let him work toward sharpening the wave for a few seconds, knowing that it was already too late for him, knowing that her own team would gain from the slight improvement. Jamil was impressed. It took an extraordinary level of skill and confidence to do what she'd just done. For all the time he'd spent away, he knew exactly what to expect from the rest of the players, and in Margit's absence, he would probably have been wishing out loud for a talented newcomer to make the game interesting again. Still, it was hard not to feel a slight sting of resentment. Someone should have warned him just how good she was. With the modes, one sec. There are like no part breaks in this at all, so I'm having to grab water where I can. I'm sorry. With the modes slipping out of phase, the wave undulated all over the field again. But its reconvergence was inevitable. Unlike a wave of water or sound, it possessed no hidden degrees of freedom to grind its precision into entropy. Jamil decided to ignore Margit. There were cruder strategies than mirror blocking that worked almost as well. Chusak was filling the 210 mode now. Jamil chose the 4-6 as his spoiler. All they had to do was keep the wave from growing much sharper, and it didn't matter whether they achieved this by preserving the status quo or by nudging it from one kind of bluntness to another. The steady resistance as he f- the steady resistance he felt as he ran told Jamil he was driving the transition, unblocked, but he searched in vain for some visible sign of success. When he reached a vantage point where he could take in enough of the field in one glance to judge the spectrum properly, he noticed a rapidly vibrating shimmer across the width of the wave. He counted 9 peaks. Good parity. Margit had pulled most of the amplitude straight out of his spoiler mode and fed it into this. It was a mad waste of energy to aim for such an elevated harmonic, but no one had been looking there. No one had stopped her. The scoring pattern was forming again, and he only had 9 or 10 seconds left to make up for all the time he'd wasted. Jamil chose the strongest good parity mode in his territory and the emptiest bad one, computed the velocity that would link them, and ran. He didn't dare turn to watch the opposition goal. He didn't want to break his concentration. The wave retreated around his feet, less like an earthly ebb tide than an ocean drawn into the sky by a passing black hole. The city diligently portrayed the shadow that his body would have cast, shrinking in front of him as the Tower of Light rose. The verdict was announced. 50.1. The air was filled with shouts of triumph. Ezekiel's the loudest, as always. Jamil sagged to his knees, laughing. It was a curious feeling, familiar as it was. He cared, and he didn't. If he'd been wholly indifferent to the outcome of the game, there would have been no pleasure in it. But obsessing over every defeat, or every victory, could ruin it just as thoroughly. He could almost see himself walking the line, orchestrating his response as carefully as any action in the game itself. He lay down on the grass to catch his breath before play resumed. The outer face of the micro-sun that orbited Laplace was shielded with rock, but light reflected skywards from the land beneath it crossed the 100,000-kilometer width of the three-toroidal universe to give a faint glow to the planet's night side. Though only a sliver was lit directly, Jamil could discern the full disk of the opposite hemisphere in the primary image at the zenith, continents and oceans that lay, by a shorter route. I skipped a line. I'm glad I caught myself before I read a skipped line. Jamil could discern the full disk of the opposite hemisphere in the primary image at the zenith, continents and oceans that lay, by a shorter route, 12,000 or so kilometers beneath him. Other views in the lattice of images spread across the sky were from different angles, and showed substantial crescents of the dayside itself. The one thing you couldn't find in any of these images, even with a telescope, was your own city. The topology of this universe let you see the back of your head, but never your reflection. Thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele. Thank you for coming here for the algorithm.
One person watching this, but it's showing 69K likes? That can't be right. On YouTube, I presume? That'd be weird. Oh boy, I better make sure I have that muted so it doesn't, do 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 do. Sorry. I know I'm interrupting myself. I don't see any like. Cool though, if the algorithm is just throwing likes my way for no reason. Whatever. Moving right along. I'm not going to think too hard about it because there's no point. Thank you for telling me though. I'll um, I'll look into that, I guess. I'll figure out what's going on. Ah. Jamil's team lost 3-0. He staggered over to the fountains at the edge of the field and slaked his thirst, shocked by the pleasure of the simple act. Just to be alive was glorious now, but once he felt this way, anything seemed possible. He was back in sync, back in phase, and he was going to make the most of it, for however long it lasted. He caught up with the others, who'd headed down toward the river. Ezekiel hooked an arm around his neck, laughing. "Bad luck, Sleeping Beauty! You picked the wrong time to wake. With Margit, we're invincible." Jamil ducked free of him. "I won't argue with that." He looked around. "Speaking of whom," Penina said, "Gone home. She plays, that's all. No frivolous socializing after the match." Chusak added, "Or any other time." Penina shot Jamil a glance that meant, not for want of trying on Chusak's part. Jamil pondered this, wondering why it annoyed him so much. On the field, she hadn't come across as aloof and superior, just unashamedly good. He queried the city, but she'd published nothing besides her name. Nobody expected, or wished, to hear more than the tiniest fraction of another person's history. But it was rare for anyone to start a new life without carrying through something from the old as a kind of calling card, some incident or achievement from which your new neighbors could form an impression of you. They'd reached the riverbank. Jamil pulled his shirt over his head. "So, what's her story? She must have told you something." Ezekiel said, "Only that she learned to play a long time ago. She won't say where or when. She arrived in Nether at the end of last year and grew a house on the southern outskirts. No one sees her around much. No one even knows what she studies." Jamil shrugged and waded in. "Ah, well, it's a challenge to rise to." Penina laughed and splashed him teasingly. He protested. "I meant beating her at the game." Chusak said wryly, "When you turned up, I thought you'd be our secret weapon, the one player she didn't know inside out already." "I'm glad you didn't tell me that. I would have turned around and fled straight back into hibernation." "I know. That's why we all kept quiet." Chusak smiled. "Welcome back." Penina said, "Yeah, welcome back, Jamil." Sunlight shone on the surface of the river. Jamil ached all over, but the cool water was the perfect place to be. If he wished, he could build a partition in his mind at the point where he stood right now, and never fall beneath it. Other people lived that way, and it seemed to cost them nothing. Contrast was overrated. No sane person spent half their time driving spikes into their flesh for the sake of feeling better when they stopped. Ezekiel lived every day with the happy boisterousness of a 5-year-old. Jamil sometimes found this annoying, but then any kind of disposition would irritate someone. His own stretches of meaningless somberness weren't exactly a boon to his friends. Chusak said, "I've invited everyone to a meal at my house tonight. Will you come?" Jamil thought it over, then shook his head. He still wasn't ready. He couldn't force feed himself with normality. It didn't speed his recovery, it just drove him backward. Chusak looked disappointed, but there was nothing to be done about that. Jamil promised him, "Next time, okay?" Ezekiel sighed. "What are we gonna do with you? You're worse than Margit." Jamil started backing away, but it was too late. Ezekiel reached him in two casual strides, bent down and grabbed him around the waist, hoisted him effortlessly onto one shoulder, then flung him through the air into the depths of the river. Jamil was woken by the scent of wood smoke. His room was still filled with the night's gray shadows, but when he propped himself up on one elbow and the window obliged him with transparency, the city was etched clearly in the pre-dawn light. He dressed and left the house, surprised at the coolness of the dew on his feet. No one else in his street seemed to be up. Had they failed to notice the smell, or did they already know to expect it? He turned a corner and saw the rising column of soot, faintly lit with red from below. The flames and the ruins were still hidden from him, but he knew whose house it was. When he reached the dying blaze, he crouched in the heat-withered garden, cursing himself. Chusak had offered him the chance to join him for his last meal in Nether. Whatever hints you dropped, it was customary to tell no one that you were moving on. If you still had a lover, if you still had young children, you never deserted them. But friends, you warned in subtle ways, before vanishing. Jamil covered his head with his arms. He'd lived through this countless times before, but it never became easier. If anything, it grew worse, as every departure was weighted with the memories of others. His brothers and sisters had scattered across the branches of the new territories. He'd walked away from his father and mother when he was too young and confident to realize how much it would hurt him, decades later. His own children had all abandoned him eventually, far more often than he'd left them. It was easier to leave an ex-lover than a grown child. Something burned itself out in a couple almost naturally, as if ancestral biology had prepared them for at least that one rift. Jamil stopped fighting the tears, but as he brushed them away, he caught sight of someone standing beside him. He looked up. It was Margit. He felt a need to explain. He rose to his feet and addressed her. "This was Chusak's house. We were good friends. I'd known him for 96 years. Margit gazed back at him, neutrally. "Boo-hoo. Poor baby. You'll never see your friend again." Jamil almost laughed. Her rudeness was so surreal. He pushed on, as if the only conceivable, polite response was to pretend that he hadn't heard her. "No one is the kindest, the most generous, the most loyal. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. Everyone's unique. Chusak was Chusak." He banged a fist against his chest, utterly heedless now of her contemptuous words. "There's a hole in me, and it will never be filled." That was the truth, even though he'd grow around it. He should have gone to the meal. It would have cost him nothing. "You must be in a real emotional Swiss cheese," observed Margit tartly. Jamil came to his senses. "Why don't you go fuck off to some other universe? No one wants you in Nether." Margit was amused. "You are a bad loser." Jamil gazed at her, honestly confused for a moment. The game had slipped his mind completely. He gestured at the embers. What are you doing here? Why did you follow the smoke, if it wasn't regret at not saying goodbye to him when you had the chance? He wasn't sure how seriously to take Penina's light-hearted insinuation, but if Chusak had fallen for Margit, and it had not been reciprocated, that might even have been the reason he'd left. She shook her head calmly. He was nothing to me. I barely spoke to him. Well, that's your loss. From the look of things, I'd say the loss was all yours. He had no reply. Margit turned and walked away. Jamil crouched on the ground again, rocking back and forth, waiting for the pain to subside. Jamil spent the next week preparing to resume his studies. The library had near instantaneous contact with every artificial universe in the new territories, and the additional light speed lag between Earth and the point in space from which the whole tree structure blossomed was only a few hours. Jamil had been to Earth, but only as a tourist. Land was scarce, they accepted no migrants. There were remote planets you could live on, in the home universe, but you had to be a certain kind of masochistic purist to want that. The precise reasons why his ancestors had entered the new territories had been forgotten generations before, and it would have been presumptuous to track them down and ask them in person. But given a choice between the then ever more crowded Earth, the horrifying reality of interstellar distances, and an endlessly extensible branching chain of worlds which could be traversed within a matter of weeks, the decision wasn't exactly baffling. Jamil had devoted most of his time in Noether. I keep stumbling on this word. I'm sorry. This the name of the city they live in. Noether. No ether. Nother. Nother. Nether. Neither. Sorry. Nother. Nother. Sorry. Feedback loop. Jamil had demoted. Jamil had devoted most of his time in Noether to study the category of representations of Lie groups, Lie groups on complex vector spaces, with a capital L, Lie. Lie groups on complex vector spaces, a fitting choice since Emmy Noether had been a pioneer of group theory, and if she'd lived to see this field blossom, she would probably have been in the thick of it herself. Representations of Lie groups lay behind most of physics. Each kind of subatomic particle was really nothing but a particular way of representing the universal symmetry group as a set of rotations of complex vectors. Organizing this kind of structure with category theory was ancient knowledge, but Jamil didn't care. He'd long ago reconciled himself to being a student, not a discoverer. The greatest gift of consciousness was the ability to take the patterns of the world inside you, and for all that he would have relished the thrill of being the first at anything, with 10 to the 16th people alive, that was a futile ambition at most. In the library, he spoke with his fellow students of his chosen field on other worlds, or read their latest works. Though they were not researchers, they could still put a new pedagogical spin on old material, enriching the connections with other fields, finding ways to make the complex, subtle truth easier to assimilate without sacrificing the depth and detail that made it worth knowing in the first place. They would not advance the frontiers of knowledge. They would not discover new principles of nature or invent new technologies. But to Jamil, understanding was an end in itself. He rarely thought about the prospect of playing another match, and when he did, the idea was not appealing. With Chusak gone, the same group could play 10 to a side without Jamil and to skew the numbers. Margit might even choose to swap teams, if only for the sake of proving that her current team's monotonous string of victories really had been entirely down to her. When the day arrived, though, he found himself unable to stay away. He turned up intending to remain a spectator, but Ryuichi had deserted Ezekiel's team, and everyone begged Jamil to join in. As he took his place opposite Margit, there was nothing in her demeanor to acknowledge their previous encounter. No lingering contempt, but no hint of shame either. Jamil resolved to put it out of his mind. He owed it to his fellow players to concentrate on the game. They lost 5-0. Jamil forced himself to follow everyone to Eudor's house, to celebrate, commiserate, or, as it turned out, to forget the whole thing. After they'd eaten, Jamil wandered from room to room, enjoying Eudor's choice of music, but unable to settle into any conversation. No one mentioned Chuseok in his hearing. He left just after midnight. Laplace's near full primary image and its 8 bright gibbous companions lit the streets so well that there was no need for anything more. Jamil thought Chuseok might have merely traveled to another city, beneath his gaze right now, and wherever he'd gone, he might yet choose to stay in touch with his friends from Nother. And his friends from the next town? And the next? Century after century? Margit was sitting on Jamil's doorstep, holding a bunch of white flowers in one hand. Jamil was irritated. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize." He shrugged. "There's no need. We feel differently about certain things. That's fine. I can still face you on the playing field." "I'm not apologizing for a difference of opinion. I wasn't honest with you. I was cruel." She shaded her eyes against the glare of the planet and looked up at him. "You were right. It was my loss. I wish I'd known your friend." He laughed curtly. "Well, it's too late for that." She said simply, "I know." Jamil relented. "Do you want to come in?" Margit nodded, and he instructed the door to open for her. As he followed her inside, he said, "How long have you been here? Have you eaten?" "No." "I'll cook something for you." "You don't have to do that." He called out to her from the kitchen. Think of it as a peace offering. I don't have any flowers." Margit replied, "They're not for you. They're for Chuseok's house." Jamil stopped rummaging through his vegetable bins and walked back into the living room. People don't usually do that in Nother. Margit was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. "I'm so lonely here. I can't bear it any more." He sat beside her. "Then why did you rebuff him? You could at least have been friends." She shook her head. "Don't ask me to explain." Jamil took her hand. She turned and embraced him, trembling miserably. He stroked her hair. "Shh." She said, "Just sex. I don't want anything more." He groaned softly. There's no such thing as that." "I just need to touch someone to touch me again." "I understand," he confessed. "So do I. But that won't be all. So don't ask me to promise there'll be nothing more." Margit took his face in her hands and kissed him. Her mouth tasted of wood smoke. Jamil said, "I don't even know you." "No one knows anyone anymore." "That's not true." "No, it's not," she conceded gloomily. She ran a hand lightly along his arm. Jamil wanted badly to see her smile, so he made each dark hair thicken and blossom into a violet flower as it passed beneath her fingers. She did smile, but she said, "I've seen that trick before." Jamil was annoyed. "I'm sure to be a disappointment all around, then. I expect you'd be happier with some kind of novelty. A unicorn, or an amoeba." She laughed. "I don't think so." She took his hand and placed it against her breast. "Do you ever get tired of sex?" Do you ever get tired of breathing?" "I can go for a long time without thinking about it." He nodded. But then one day you stop and fill your lungs with air, and it's still as sweet as ever. Jamil didn't know what he was feeling anymore. Lust, compassion, spite. She'd come to him hurting, and he wanted to help her, but he wasn't sure that either of them really believed this would work. Margit inhaled the scent of the flowers on his arm. Are they the same color everywhere else? He said, There's only one way to find out. Jamil woke in the early hours of the morning, alone. He'd half expected Margit to flee like this, but she could have waited till dawn. He would have obligingly feigned sleep while she dressed and tiptoed out. Then he heard her. It was not a sound he would normally have associated with a human being, but it could not have been anything else. He found her in the kitchen, curled around a table leg, wailing rhythmically. He stood back and watched her, afraid that anything he did would only make things worse. She met his gaze in the half light, but kept up the mechanical whimper. Her eyes weren't blank. She was not delirious or hallucinating. She knew exactly who and where she was. Finally, Jamil knelt in the doorway. He said, Whatever it is, you can tell me, and we'll fix it. We'll find a way. She bared her teeth. You can't fix it, you stupid child. She resumed the awful noise. Then just tell me, please? He stretched out a hand toward her. He hadn't felt quite so helpless since his very first daughter, Aminata, had come to him as an inconsolable 6-year-old, rejected by the boy to whom she'd declared her undying love. He'd been 24 years old, a child himself, more than 1,000 years ago. Where are you now, Nata? Margit said, I promised I'd never tell. Promised who? Myself. Good. They're the easiest kind to break. She started weeping. It was a more ordinary sound, but it was even more chilling. She was not a wounded animal now, an alien being suffering some incomprehensible pain. Jamil approached her cautiously. She let him wrap his arms around her shoulders. He whispered, Come to bed. The warmth will help. Just being held will help. She spat at him derisively. It won't bring her back. Who? Margit stared at him in silence, as if he'd said something shocking. Jamil insisted gently. Who won't it bring back? She'd lost a friend, badly, the way he'd lost Chusak. That was why she'd sought him out. He could help her through it. They could help each other through it. She said, It won't bring back the dead. Margit was 7,594 years old. Jamil persuaded her to sit at the kitchen table. He wrapped her in blankets, then fed her tomatoes and rice, as she told him how she'd witnessed the birth of his world. The promise had shimmered just beyond reach for decades. Almost none of her contemporaries had believed it would happen, though the truth should have been plain for centuries. The human body was a material thing. In time, with enough knowledge and effort, it would become possible to safeguard it from any kind of deterioration, any kind of harm. Stellar evolution and cosmic entropy might or might not prove insurmountable, but there'd be eons to confront those challenges. In the middle of the 21st century, the hurdles were aging, disease, violence, and an overcrowded planet. Grace was my best friend. We were students. Margit smiled. Before everyone was a student. Before everyone was a student. We'd talk about it, but we didn't believe we'd see it happen. It would come in another century. It would come for our great-great-grandchildren. We'd hold infants on our knees in our twilight years and tell ourselves this one would never die. When we were both 22, something happened to both of us. She lowered her eyes. We were kidnapped. We were raped. We were tortured. Jamil didn't know how to respond. These were just words to him. He knew their meaning. He knew these acts would have hurt her, but she might as well have been describing a mathematical theorem. He stretched a hand across the table, but Margit ignored it. He said awkwardly, "This was the Holocaust?" She looked up at him, shaking her head, almost laughing at his naivete. "Not even one of them. Not a war, not a pogrom. Just one psychopathic man. He locked us in his basement for 6 months. He'd killed 7 women." Tears began spilling down her cheeks. "He showed us the bodies. They were buried right where we slept. He showed us how we'd end up when he was through with us." Jamil was numb. He'd known all his adult life what had once been possible, what had once happened to real people, but it had all been consigned to history long before his birth. In retrospect, it seemed almost inconceivably stupid, but he'd always imagined that the changes had come in such a way that no one still living had experienced these horrors. There'd been no escaping the bare minimum, the logical necessity. His oldest living ancestors must have watched their parents fall peacefully into eternal sleep. But not this. Not a flesh and blood woman sitting in front of him who'd been forced to sleep in a killer's graveyard. He put his hand over hers and choked out the words. "This man killed Grace? He killed your friend?" Margit began sobbing, but she shook her head. "No, no. We got out." She twisted her mouth into a smile. "Someone stabbed the stupid fucker in a barroom brawl. We dug our way out while he was in hospital." She put her face down on the table and wept, but she held Jamil's hand against her cheek. He couldn't understand what she'd lived through, but that didn't mean he couldn't console her. Hadn't he touched his mother's face the same way when she was sad beyond his childish comprehension? She composed herself and continued. "We made a resolution while we were in there. If we survived, there'd be no more empty promises, no more daydreams. What he'd done to those 7 women and what he'd done to us would become impossible." And it had. Whatever harm befell your body, you had the power to shut off your senses and decline to experience it. If the flesh was damaged, it could always be repaired or replaced. In the unlikely event that your jewel itself was destroyed, everyone had backups scattered across universes. No human being could inflict physical pain on another. In theory, you could still be killed, but it would take the same kind of resources as destroying a galaxy. The only people who seriously contemplated either were the villains in very bad operas. Jamil's eyes narrowed in wonder. She'd spoken those last words with such fierce pride that there was no question of her having failed. "You are Indoli? You invented the jewel?" As a child, he'd been told that the machine in his skull had been designed by a man who died long ago. Margit stroked his hand, amused. "In those days, very few Hungarian women could be mistaken for Nigerian men. I've never changed my body that much, Jamil. I've always looked much as you see me." I realize she's not speaking with a Hungarian accent. No, I don't care. Jamil was relieved. If she'd been Indoli himself, he might have succumbed to sheer awe and started babbling idolatrous nonsense. "But you worked with Indoli? You and Grace?" She shook her head. "We made the resolution, then we floundered. We were mathematicians, not neurologists. There were 1,000 things going on at once: tissue engineering, brain imaging, molecular computers. We had no real idea where to put our efforts, which problems we should bring our strengths to bear upon. And Dolly's work didn't come out of the blue for us, but we played no part in it. For a while, almost everyone was nervous about switching from the brain to the jewel. In the early days, the jewel was a separate device that learned its task by mimicking the brain, and it had to be handed control of the body at one chosen moment. It took another 50 years before it could be engineered to replace the brain incrementally, neuron by neuron, in a seamless transition throughout adolescence. If the jewel sounds familiar, that's because it was in, I think it was in the Axiomatic short story collection. So this is another example of Greg Egan coming back to an idea years down the road and expanding on it. So Grace had lived to see the jewel invented, but held back and died before she could use it? Jamil kept himself from blurting out this conclusion. All his guesses had proved wrong so far. Margit continued. Some people weren't just nervous, though. You'd be amazed how vehemently Ndoli was denounced in certain quarters. And I don't just mean the fanatics who churned out paranoid tracts about the machines taking over with their evil, inhuman agendas. Some people's antagonism had nothing to do with the specifics of the technology. They were opposed to immortality, in principle. Jamil laughed. Why? 10,000 years' worth of sophistry doesn't vanish overnight. Margit observed dryly. Every human culture had expended vast amounts of intellectual effort on the problem of coming to terms with death. Most religions had constructed elaborate lies about it, making it out to be something other than it was, though a few were dishonest about life instead. But even the most secular philosophies were warped by the need to pretend that death was for the best. It was the naturalistic fallacy at its most extreme, and its most transparent, but that didn't stop anyone. Since any child could tell you that death was meaningless, contingent, unjust, and abhorrent beyond words, it was a hallmark of sophistication to believe otherwise. Writers had consoled themselves for centuries with smug, puritanical fables about immortals who'd long for death, who'd beg for death. It would have been too much to expect all those who were suddenly faced with the reality of its banishment to confess that they'd been whistling in the dark. And would-be moral philosophers, mostly those who'd experienced no greater inconvenience in their lives than a late train or a surly waiter, began wailing about the destruction of the human spirit by this hideous blight. We needed death and suffering to put steel into our souls, not horrible, horrible freedom and safety. Jamil smiled. So there were buffoons. But in the end, surely they swallowed their pride. If we're walking in a desert and I tell you that the lake you see ahead is a mirage, I might cling stubbornly to my own belief to save myself from disappointment. But when we arrive and I'm proven wrong, I will drink from the lake. Margit nodded. Most of the loudest of these people went quiet in the end. But there were subtler arguments, too. Like it or not, all our biology and all of our culture had evolved in the presence of death. And almost every righteous struggle in history, every worthwhile sacrifice, had been against suffering, against violence, against death. Now that struggle would become impossible. Yes, Jamil was mystified, but only because it had triumphed. Margit said gently, I know. There was no sense to it, and it was always my belief that anything worth fighting for, over centuries, over millennia, was worth attaining. It can't be noble to toil for a cause and even to die for it unless it's also noble to succeed. To claim otherwise isn't sophistication, it's just a kind of hypocrisy. If it's better to travel than arrive, you shouldn't start the voyage in the first place. I told Grace as much, and she agreed. We laughed together at what we called the tragedians, the people who denounced the coming age as the age without martyrs, the age without saints, the age without revolutionaries. There would never be another Gandhi, another Mandela, another Aung San Suu Kyi. And yes, it was a kind of loss. But would any great leader have sentenced humanity to eternal misery for the sake of providing a suitable backdrop for eternal heroism? Well, some of them would have, but the downtrodden themselves had better things to do. Margit fell silent. Jamil cleared her plate away, then sat opposite her again. It was almost dawn. Of course, the jewel was not enough, Margit continued. With care, Earth could support 40 billion people, but where would the rest go? The jewel made virtual reality the easiest escape route. For a fraction of the space, a fraction of the energy, it could survive without a body attached. Grace and I weren't horrified by that prospect, the way some people were. But it was not the best outcome. It was not what most people wanted, the way they wanted freedom from death. So we studied gravity. We studied the vacuum. Jamil feared making a fool of himself again, but from the expression on her face, he knew he wasn't wrong this time. M. Osvat and G. Fust, co-authors of the seminal paper, but no more was known about them than those abbreviated names. You gave us the new territories? Margit nodded slightly. Grace and I. Jamil was overwhelmed with love for her. He went to her and knelt down to put his arms around her waist. Margit touched his shoulder. Come on, don't get up. Come on, get up. Don't treat me like a god. It just makes me feel old. He stood, smiling abashedly. Anyone in pain deserved his help, but if he was not in her debt, the word had no meaning. And Grace? He asked. Margit looked away. Grace completed her work and then decided she was a tragedian after all. Rape was impossible. Torture was impossible. Poverty was vanishing. Death was receding into cosmology, into metaphysics. It was everything she'd hoped would come to pass. And for her, suddenly faced with that fulfillment, everything that remained seemed trivial. One night she climbed into the furnace in the basement of her building. Her jewel survived the flames, but she'd erased it from within. It was morning now. Jamil was beginning to feel disoriented. Margit should have vanished in daylight, an apparition unable to persist in the mundane world. I'd lost other people who were close to me, she said. My parents, my brother, friends. And so had everyone around me, then. I wasn't special. Grief was still commonplace. But decade by decade, century by century, we shrank into insignificance, those of us who knew what it meant to lose someone forever. We're less than 1 in a million now. For a long time, I clung to my own generation. There were enclaves, there were ghettos, where everyone understood the old days. I spent 200 years married to a man who wrote a play called We Who Have Known the Dead, which was every bit as pretentious and self-pitying as you'd guess from the title. She smiled at the memory. It was a horrible, self-devouring world. If I'd stayed in it much longer, I would have followed Grace. I would have begged for death. She looked up at Jamil. It's people like you I want to be with. People who don't understand. Your lives aren't trivial, any more than the best parts of our own were. All the tranquility, all the beauty, all the happiness that made the sacrifices and the life and death struggles worthwhile. The tragedians were wrong. They had everything upside down. Death never gave meaning to life. It was always the other way around. All of its gravitas, all of its significance, was stolen from the things it ended. But the value of life always lay entirely in itself, not in its loss, not in its fragility. Grace should have lived to see that. She should have lived long enough to understand that the world hadn't turned to ash. Jamil sat in silence, turning the whole confession over in his mind, trying to absorb it well enough not to add to her distress with a misjudged question. Finally, he ventured, "Why do you hold back from friendship with us, though? Because we're just children to you? Children who can't understand what you've lost?" Margit shook her head vehemently. "I don't want you to understand. People like me are the only blight on this world, the only poison." She smiled at Jamil's expression of anguish, and rushed to silence him before he could swear that she was nothing of the kind. "Not in everything we do and say, or everyone we touch. I'm not claiming that we're tainted in some fatuous mythological sense. But when I left the ghettos, I promised myself that I wouldn't bring the past with me. Sometimes that's an easy vow to keep. Sometimes it's not." "You've broken it tonight," Jamil said plainly, "and neither of us has been struck down by lightning." "I know." She took his hand. "But I was wrong to tell you what I have, and I'll fight to regain the strength to stay silent. I stand at the border between two worlds, Jamil. I remember death, and I always will. But my job now is to guard that border, to keep that knowledge from invading your world." "We're not as fragile as you think," he protested. "We all know something about loss." Margit nodded soberly. "Your friend Chusak has vanished into the crowd. That's how things work now, how you keep yourselves from suffocating in a jungle of endlessly growing connections, or fragmenting into isolated troops of repertory players, endlessly churning out the same lines. You have your little deaths, and I don't call them that to deride them, but I've seen both, and I promise you they're not the same." In the weeks that followed, Jamil resumed in full the life he'd made for himself in Nether. 5 days in 7 were for the difficult beauty of mathematics. The rest were for his friends. He kept playing matches, and Margit's team kept winning. In the 6th game, though, Jamil's team finally scored against her. Their defeat was only 3-1. Each night, Jamil struggled with the question: what exactly did he owe her? Eternal loyalty? Eternal silence? Eternal obedience? She hadn't sworn him to secrecy. She'd extracted no promises at all. But he knew she was trusting him to comply with her wishes, so what right did he have to do otherwise? 8 weeks after the night he'd spent with Margit, Jamil found himself alone with Penina in a room in Jorasy's house. They'd been talking about the old days, talking about Chusak. Jamil said, "Margit lost someone very close to her." Penina nodded matter-of-factly, but curled into a comfortable position on the couch and prepared to take in every word. "Not in the way we've lost Chusak. Not in the way you think at all." Jamil approached the others, one by one. His confidence ebbed and flowed. He'd glimpsed the old world, but he couldn't pretend to have fathomed its inhabitants. What if Margit saw this as worse than betrayal? As a further torture, a further rape? But he couldn't stand by and leave her to the torture she'd inflicted on herself. Ezekiel was the hardest to face. Jamil spent a sick and sleepless night beforehand, wondering if this would make him a monster, a corrupter of children, the epitome of everything Margit believed she was fighting. Ezekiel wept freely, but he was not a child. He was older than Jamil, and he had more steel in his soul than any of them. He said, "I guessed it might be that. I guessed she might have seen the bad times, but I never found a way to ask her." The three lobes of probability converged, melted into a plateau, rose into a pillar of light. The umpire said, 55.9. It was Margit's most impressive goal yet. Ezekiel whooped joyfully and ran toward her. When he scooped her up in his arms and threw her across his shoulders, she laughed and indulged him. When Jamil stood beside him and they made a joint throne for her with their arms, she frowned down at him and said, "You shouldn't be doing this. You're on the losing side." The rest of the players converged on them, cheering, and they started down toward the river. Margit looked around nervously. "What is this? We haven't finished playing." Penina said, "The game's over early, just this once. Think of this as an invitation. We want you to swim with us. We want you to talk to us. We want to hear everything about your life." Margit's composure began to crack. She squeezed Jamil's shoulder. He whispered, "Say the word and we'll put you down." Margit didn't whisper back. She shouted miserably, "What do you want from me, you parasites? I've won your fucking game for you. What more do you want?" Jamil was mortified. He stopped and prepared to lower her, prepared to retreat, but Ezekiel caught his arm. Ezekiel said, "We want to be your border guards. We want to stand beside you." Krista added, "We can't face what you've faced, but we want to understand as much as we can." Joracy spoke, then Yan, Narcisa, Maria, Halide. Margit looked down on them, weeping, confused. Jamil burned with shame. He'd hijacked her, humiliated her. He'd made everything worse. She'd flee Nother, flee into a new exile, more alone than ever. When everyone had spoken, silence descended. Margit trembled on her throne. Jamil faced the ground. He couldn't undo what he'd done. He said quietly, "Now you know our wishes. Will you tell us yours?" "Put me down." Jamil and Ezekiel complied. Margit looked around her at her teammates and her opponents, her children, her creation, her would-be friends. She said, "I want to go to the river with you. I'm 7,000 years old, and I want to learn how to swim. Sorry, and I want to learn to swim." Author's note. Readers can find an interactive illustration of quantum soccer at www.gregegan.net/border/soccer/soccer.html. I will post a link to that in the chat. In just a sec. GregEgan.net. Really? Come on. He just gave me a bandwidth warning that it can't sustain the bandwidth. Did he just die? Oh, don't even say that, Frag. I don't want to hear that. There's GregEgan.net. Anyway, that was Border Guards by Greg Egan. Pretty wild vision of the future there. Here we go. Quantum Soccer. His website I think is under siege for some reason. Um, Come on. Let me just get the web address here. There we go. When the website is up and running again, it appears to be not down, but just beleaguered. Is it down? Or is it just me? Oh, well, convenient while I check this. I'm getting a phone call. I'll be right back. Give me a moment here, and then we'll bang out what is it called? Glory, right? I think that's the title. Glory. Yes, it's another. Yes, it is down for everyone. It is not just me. So when that comes back, um, it's not a phone call. It's a text message that I have to respond to. Um, all right, just give me 5 minutes. I'll be right back.
Alrighty. Hello? Oh, yes, that's right. It puts that up there. Sorry about that. My bad. Had to take care of that real quick. It's tied somewhat to the reason I'm not around next week. Less said on that, the better. Okay, so next we have Glory. This does have actual chapter breaks, which is good. All right, I just have to remember to do next time I read Riding the Crocodile, and then skip Glory and go to Hot Rock the week after. It'll be pretty easy to remember because Riding the Crocodile is like 50 pages long, give or take. It's pretty lengthy. Okay. So yeah, hopefully those 5 minutes gave people to mull over, or however long it was, gave people time to mull over that interesting story. It ties into some of his earlier stories. It starts off as what are sports like in the future, super distant future, and turns into how do immortal, post-scarcity, utopic humans deal with grief? Would they even understand the concept? And the truth is they do, basically. Or if they don't, they want to understand more because those of us who delight in people's suffering have basically winnowed themselves out, as it were, I guess is the implication. Glory by Greg Egan. Chapter 1. An ingot of metallic hydrogen gleamed in the starlight, a narrow cylinder half a meter long with a mass of about a kilogram. To the naked eye it was a dense, solid object, but its lattice of tiny nuclei immersed in an insubstantial fog of electrons was 1 part matter to 200 trillion parts empty space. A short distance away was a second ingot, apparently identical to the first, but composed of antihydrogen. A sequence of finely tuned gamma rays flooded into both cylinders. The protons that absorbed them in the first ingot spat out positrons and were transformed into neutrons, breaking their bonds to the electron cloud that glued them in place. In the second ingot, antiprotons became antineutrons. A further sequence of pulses herded the neutrons together and forged them into clusters. The antineutrons were similarly rearranged. Both kinds of cluster were unstable, but in order to fall apart, they first had to pass through a quantum state that would have strongly absorbed a component of the gamma rays constantly raining down on them. Left to themselves, the probability of them being in this state would have increased rapidly, but each time they measurably failed to absorb the gamma rays, the probability fell back to zero. The quantum Zeno effect endlessly reset the clock, holding the decay in check. The next series of pulses began shifting the clusters into the space that had separated the original ingots. First neutrons, then maybe. Okay. Call didn't come through, whatever it was. Possibly there will be another interruption. My bad. Uh, the next series of pulses began shifting the clusters into the space that had separated the original ingots. First neutrons, then antineutrons, were sculpted together in alternating layers.
Though the clusters were ultimately unstable, while they persisted they were inert, sequestering their constituents and preventing them from annihilating their counterparts. The end point of this process of nuclear sculpting was a sliver of compressed matter and antimatter sandwiched together into a needle 1 micron wide. The gamma ray lasers shut down. The Xeno effect, with a Z, withdrew its prohibitions. For the time it took a beam of light to cross a neutron, the needle sat motionless in space. Then it began to burn, and it began to move. The needle was structured like a meticulously crafted firework, and its outer layers ignited first. No external casing could have channeled this blast, but the pattern of tensions woven into the needle's construction favored one direction for the debris to be expelled. Particles streamed backward. The needle moved forward. The shock of acceleration could not have been borne by anything built from atomic scale matter, but the pressure bearing down on the core of the needle prolonged its life, delaying the inevitable. Layer after layer burned itself away, blasting the dwindling remnant forward ever faster. By the time the needle had shrunk to a tenth of its original size, it was moving at 98% of light speed. To a bystander, this could scarcely have been improved upon, but from the needle's perspective, there was still room to slash its journey's duration by orders of magnitude. When just 1,000th of the needle remained, its time, compared to the neighboring stars, was passing 500 times more slowly. Still the layers kept burning, the protective clusters unraveling as the pressure on them was released. The needle could only reach close enough to light speed to slow down time as much as it required if it could did I skip a line? The needle could only reach close enough to the light The needle could only reach close enough to light speed to slow down time as much as it required if it could sacrifice a large enough proportion of its remaining mass. The core of the needle could only survive for a few trillionths of a second, while its journey would take 200 million seconds as judged by the stars. The proportions had been carefully matched, though. Out of the 2 kilograms of matter and antimatter that had been woven together at the launch, only a few million neutrons were needed as the final payload. By one measure, 7 years passed. For the needle, its last trillionths of a second unwound, its final layers of fuel blew away, and at the moment its core was ready to explode, it reached its destination, plunging from the near vacuum of space straight into the heart of a star. Even here, the density of matter was insufficient to stabilize the core, yet far too high to allow it to pass unhindered. The core was torn apart. But it did not go quietly, and the shock waves it carved through the fusing plasma endured for 1 million kilometers, all the way through to the cooler outer layers on the opposite side of the star. These shock waves were shaped by the payload that had formed them, and though the initial pattern imprinted on them by the disintegrating cluster of neutrons was enlarged and blurred by its journey on an atomic scale, it remained sharply defined. Like a mold stamped into the seething plasma, it encouraged ionized molecular fragments to slip into the troughs and furrows that matched their shape, and then brought them together to react in ways that the plasma's random collisions would never have allowed. In effect, the shock waves formed a web of catalysts, carefully laid out in both time and space, briefly transforming a small corner of the star into a chemical factory operating on a nanometer scale. The products of this factory sprayed out of the star, riding the last traces of the shock wave's momentum. A few nanograms of elaborate, carbon-rich molecules sheathed in a protective fullerene weave. Traveling at 700 kilometers per second, a fraction below the velocity needed to escape from the star completely, they climbed out of its gravity well, slowing as they ascended. 4 years passed, but the molecules were stable against the ravages of space. By the time they'd traveled 1 billion kilometers away, Whoops. By the time they'd traveled 1 billion kilometers, they had almost come to a halt, and they would have fallen back to die in the fires of the star that had forged them if their journey had not been timed so that the star's third planet, a gas giant, was waiting to urge them forward. As they fell toward it, the giant's third moon moved across their path. 11 years after the needle's launch, its molecular offspring rained down into the methane. Whoa! Its molecular offspring rained down onto the methane snow. Sorry about that. The tiny heat of their impact was not enough to damage them, but it melted a microscopic puddle in the snow. Surrounded by food, the molecular seeds began to grow. Within hours, the area was teeming with nanomachines, some mining the snow and the minerals beneath it, others assembling the bounty into an intricate structure, a rectangular panel a couple of meters wide. From across the light years, an elaborate sequence of gamma ray pulses fell upon the panel. These pulses were the needle's true payload, the passengers for whom it had merely prepared the way, transmitted in its wake 4 years after its launch. The panel decoded and stored the data, and the army of nanomachines set to work again, this time following a far more elaborate blueprint. The miners were forced to look further afield to find all the elements that were needed, while the assemblers labored to reach their goal through a sequence of intermediate stages, carefully designed to protect the. Oh my god, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Yawn catching me out of nowhere, twice in one paragraph. The miners were forced to look further afield to find all the elements that were needed, while the assemblers labored to reach their goal through a sequence of intermediate stages, carefully designed to protect the final product from the vagaries of the local chemistry and climate. After 3 months' work, two small fusion-powered spacecraft sat in the snow. Each one held a single occupant, waking for the first time in their freshly minted bodies, yet endowed with memories of an earlier life. Joan switched on her communications console. Anne appeared on the screen, 3 short pairs of arms folded across her thorax in a posture of calm repose. They had both worn virtual bodies with the same anatomy before, but this was the first time they had become nuda in the flesh. That's Noudah with a capital N as in Nancy. Nuda in the flesh. We're here. Everything worked. Joan marveled. The language she spoke was not her own, but the structure of her new brain and body made it second nature. Anne said, "Now comes the hard part." Yes. Joan looked out from the spacecraft's cockpit. In the distance, a fissured blue-gray plateau of water ice rose above the snow. Nearby, the nanomachines were busy disassembling the gamma-ray receiver. When they had erased all traces of their handiwork, they would wander off into the snow and catalyze their own destruction. Joan had visited dozens of planet-bound cultures in the past, taking on different bodies and languages as necessary, but those cultures had all been plugged into the amalgam, the meta-civilization that spanned the galactic disk. However far from home she'd been, the means to return to familiar places had always been close at hand. The Nuda had only just mastered interplanetary flight, and they had no idea that the amalgam existed. The closest node in the amalgam's network was 7 light-years away, and even that was out of bounds to her and Anne now. They had agreed not to risk disclosing its location to the Nuda, so any transmission they sent could only be directed to a decoy node that they'd set up more than 20 light-years away. It will be worth it, Jones said. Anne's Nuda face was immobile, but chromatophores sent a wave of violet and gold sweeping across her skin in an expression of cautious optimism. We'll see. She tipped her head to the left, a gesture preceding a friendly departure. Joan tipped her own head in response, as if she'd been doing so all her life. Be careful, my friend, she said. You too. Anne's ship ascended so high on its chemical thrusters that it shrank to a speck before igniting its fusion engine and streaking away in a blaze of light. Joan felt a pang of loneliness. There was no predicting. Sorry. There was no predicting when they would be reunited. Her ship's software was primitive. The whole machine had been scrupulously matched to the Nuda's level of technology. Joan knew how to fly it herself if necessary, and on a whim she switched off the autopilot and manually activated the ascent thrusters. The control panel was crowded, but having 6 hands helped. Chapter 2. The world the Nuda called home was the closest of the system's 5 planets to their sun. The average temperature was 120 degrees Celsius, but the high atmospheric pressure allowed liquid water to exist across the entire surface. The chemistry and dynamics of the planet's crust had led to a relatively flat terrain, with a patchwork of dozens of disconnected seas but no globe-spanning ocean. From space, these seas appeared as silvery mirrors, bordered by a violet and brown tarnish of vegetation. The Nuda were already leaving their most electromagnetically promiscuous phase of communications behind, but the short-lived oasis of amalgam-level technology on Baneth, the gas giant's moon, had had no trouble eavesdropping on their chatter and preparing an updated cultural briefing which had been spliced into Joan's brain. The planet was still divided into the same 11 political units as it had been 14 years before, the time of the last broadcasts that had reached the node before Joan's departure. Tira and Gahar, the 2 dominant nations in terms of territory, economic activity, and military power, also occupied the vast majority of significant Nia archaeological sites. Joan had expected that they'd be noticed as soon as they left Baneth. The exhaust from their fusion engines glowed like the sun. But their departure had triggered no obvious response, and now that they were coasting, they'd be far harder to spot. As Anne drew closer to the homeworld, she sent a message to Tira's traffic control center. Joan tuned in to the exchange. I come in peace from another star, Anne said. I seek permission to land. There was a delay of several seconds more than the light speed lag, then a terse response. Please identify yourself and state your location. Anne transmitted her coordinates and flight plan. We confirm your location. Please identify yourself. My name is Anne. I come from another star. There was a long pause. Then a different voice answered. If you are from Gahar, please explain your intentions. I am not from Gahar. Why should I believe that? Show yourself. I've taken the same shape as your people, in the hope of living among you for a while. Anne opened a video channel and showed them her unremarkable Nuda face. But there's a signal being transmitted from these coordinates that might persuade you that I'm telling you the truth. She gave the location of the decoy node, 20 light-years away, and specified a frequency. The signal coming from the node contained an image of the very same face. This time the silence stretched out for several minutes. It would take a while for the Tirans to confirm the true distance of the radio source. You do not have permission to land. Please enter this orbit and we will rendezvous and board your ship. Parameters for the orbit came through on the data channel. Anne said, As you wish. Minutes later, Joan's instruments picked up 3 fusion ships being launched from Tyran bases. When Anne reached the prescribed orbit, Joan listened anxiously to the instructions the Tyrans issued. Their tone sounded wary, but they were entitled to treat this stranger with caution, all the more so if they believed Anne's claim. Joan was accustomed to a very different kind of reception, but then the members of the amalgam had spent hundreds of millennia establishing a framework of trust. They also benefited from a milieu in which most kinds of force had been rendered ineffectual. When everyone had backups of themselves scattered around the galaxy, it required a vastly disproportionate effort to inconvenience someone, let alone kill them. By any reasonable measure, honesty and cooperation yielded far richer rewards than subterfuge and slaughter. Nonetheless, each individual culture had its roots in a biological heritage that gave rise to behavior governed more by ancient urges than contemporary realities, and even when they mastered the technology to choose their own nature, the precise set of traits they preserved was up to them. In the worst case, a species still saddled with inappropriate drives, but empowered by advanced technology, could wreak havoc. The Nuda had deserved to be treated with courtesy and respect, but they did not yet belong in the amalgam. In the Tyrans' own exchanges were not on open channels, so once they had entered Anne's ship, Joan could only guess what was happening. She waited until 2 of the ships had returned to the surface, then sent her own message to Gahar's traffic control. I come in peace from another star. I seek permission to land. Chapter 3. The Gahari allowed Joan to fly her ship straight down to the surface. She wasn't sure if this was because they were more trusting or if they were afraid that the Tyrans might try to interfere if she lingered in orbit. The landing site was a bare plain of chocolate-colored sand. The air shimmered in the heat, the distortions intensified by the thickness of the atmosphere, making the horizon waver as if seen through molten glass. Joan waited in the cockpit as 3 trucks approached. They all came to a halt some 20 meters away. A voice over the radio instructed her to leave the ship. She complied, and after she'd stood in the open for a minute, a lone Nuda left one of the trucks and walked toward her. I'm Pirit, she said. Welcome to Gahar. Her gestures were courteous but restrained. I'm Joan. Thank you for your hospitality. Your impersonation of our biology is impeccable. There was a trace of skepticism in Pirit's tone. Joan had pointed the Gahari to her own portrait being broadcast from the decoy node, but she had to admit that in the context, her lack of exotic technology and traits would make it harder to accept the implications of that transmission. In my culture, it's a matter of courtesy to imitate one's hosts as closely as possible. Pirit hesitated, as if pondering whether to debate the merits of such a custom, but then, rather than quibbling over the niceties of interspecies etiquette, she chose to confront the real issue head-on. If you're a Tyran spy or a defector, the sooner you admit that, the better. That's very sensible advice, but I'm neither. The Nuda wore no clothing as such, but Pirit had a belt with a number of pouches. She took a handheld scanner from one and ran it over Joan's body. Joan's briefing suggested that it was probably only checking for metal, volatile explosives, and radiation. The technology to image her body or search for pathogens would not be so portable. In any case, she was a healthy, unarmed Nuda down to the molecular level. Pirit escorted her to one of the trucks and invited her to recline in a section at the back. Another Nuda drove, while Pirit watched over Joan. They soon arrived at a small complex of buildings a couple of kilometers from where the ship had touched down. The walls, roofs, and floors of the buildings were all made from the local sand, cemented with an adhesive that the Nuda secreted from their own bodies. Inside, Joan was given a thorough medical examination, including 3 kinds of full-body scan. The Nuda who examined her treated her with a kind of detached efficiency, devoid of any pleasantries. She wasn't sure if that was their standard bedside manner, or a kind of glazed shock at having been told of her claimed origins. Pirret took her to an adjoining room and offered her a couch. The Nuda anatomy did not allow for sitting, but they liked to recline. Pirret remained standing. "How did you come here?" she asked. "You've seen my ship. I flew it from Baneth." "And how did you reach Baneth?" "I'm not free to discuss that," Joan replied cheerfully. "Not free?" Pirret's face clouded with silver, as if she was genuinely perplexed. Joan said, "You understand me perfectly. Please don't tell me there's nothing you're free. No, you're not. Wait. You understand me perfectly. Please don't tell me there's nothing you're not free to discuss with me." "You certainly didn't fly that ship 20 light years." "No, I certainly didn't." Pirret hesitated. "Did you come through the cataract?" The cataract was a black hole, a remote partner to the Nuda's sun. They orbited each other at a distance of about 80 billion kilometers. The name came from its telescopic appearance, a dark circle ringed by a distortion in the background of stars, like some kind of visual aberration. The Tirans and Gahari were in a race to be the first to visit this extraordinary neighbor, but as yet neither of them were quite up to the task. "Through the cataract? I think your scientists have already proven that black holes aren't shortcuts to anywhere." "Our scientists aren't always right." "Neither are ours," Joan admitted, "but all the evidence points in one direction. Black holes aren't doorways, they're shredding machines." "So you traveled the whole 20 light years?" "More than that," Joan said truthfully, "from my original home. I've spent half my life traveling." "Faster than light?" Pirret suggested hopefully. "No, that's impossible." They circled around the question a dozen more times before Pirret finally changed her tune from how to why. "I'm a xenomathematician," Joan said. "I've come here in the hope of collaborating with your archaeologists in their study of Nia artifacts." Pirret was stunned. "What do you know about the Nia?" "Not as much as I'd like to." Joan gestured at her Nuda body. "As I'm sure you've already surmised, we've listened to your broadcasts for some time, so we know pretty much what an ordinary Nuda knows. That includes the basic facts about the Nia. Historically, they've been referred to as your ancestors, though the latest studies suggest that you and they really just have an earlier common ancestor. They died out about 1 million years ago, but there's evidence that they might have had a sophisticated culture for as long as 3 million years. There's no indication that they ever developed space flight. Basically, once they achieved material comfort, they seem to have devoted themselves to various art forms, including mathematics." "So you've traveled 20 light years just to look at Nia tablets?" Pirret was incredulous. "Any culture that spent 3 million years doing mathematics must have something to teach us." "Really?" Pirret's face became blue with disgust. "In the 10,000 years since we discovered the wheel, we've already reached halfway to the cataract. They wasted their time on useless abstractions." Jones said, "I come from a culture of spacefarers myself, so I respect your achievements. But I don't think anyone really knows what the Nia achieved. I'd like to find out, with the help of your people." Pirret was silent for a while. "What if we say no?" "Then I'll leave empty-handed." "What if we insist that you remain with us?" "Then I'll die here empty-handed." On her command, this body would expire in an instant. She could not be held and tortured. Pirate said angrily, "You must be willing to trade something for the privilege you're demanding." "Requesting, not demanding," Joan insisted gently. "And what I'm willing to offer is my own culture's perspective on Nia mathematics. If you ask your archaeologists and mathematicians, I'm sure they'll tell you that there are many things written in the Nia tablets that they don't yet understand. My colleague and I," neither of them had mentioned Anne before, but Joan was sure that Pirret knew all about her, "simply want to shed as much light as we can on this subject." Pirret said bitterly, "You won't even tell us how you came to our world. Why should we trust you to share whatever you discover about the Nia?" "Interstellar travel is no great mystery," Joan countered. "You know all the basic science already. Making it work is just a matter of persistence. If you're left to develop your own technology, you might even come up with better methods than we have." "So we're expected to be patient, to discover these things for ourselves. But you can't wait a few centuries for us to decipher the Nia artifacts?" Joan said bluntly, "The present Nuda culture, both here and in Tira, seems to hold the Nia in contempt. Dozens of partially excavated sites containing Nia artifacts are under threat from irrigation projects and other developments. That's the reason we couldn't wait. We needed to come here and offer our assistance before the last traces of the Nia disappeared forever." Pirret did not reply, but Joan hoped she knew what her interrogator was thinking. "Nobody would cross 20 light years for a few worthless scribblings. Perhaps we've underestimated the Nia. Perhaps our ancestors have left us a great secret, a great legacy. And perhaps the fastest, perhaps the only, way to uncover it is to give this impertinent, irritating alien exactly what she wants."
And of course, I'm getting interrupted just a second ago, and I've got to respond to that as well, so bear with me another couple minutes. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Probably going to be another interruption by the time this is through, but I'm going to hope to bang through most of this by the time that occurs. I'm so sorry. This is not normal. To anyone who's tuning in for the first time, this usually isn't as many interruptions, but it happens. Chapter 4. The sun was rising ahead of them as they reached the top of the hill. Sando turned to Joan, and his face became green with pleasure. "Look behind you," he said. Joan did as he asked. The valley below was hidden in fog, and it had settled so evenly that she could see their shadows in the dawn light, stretched out across the top of the fog layer. Around the shadow of her head was a circular halo like a small rainbow. "We call it the Nia's light," Sando said. "In the old days, people used to say that the halo proved that the Nia blood was strong in you." Joan said, "The only trouble with that hypothesis is the only trouble with that hypothesis being that you see it around your head, and I see it around mine." On Earth, the phenomenon was known as a glory. The particles of fog were scattering the sunlight back toward them, turning it 180 degrees. To look at the shadow of your own head was to face directly away from the sun, so the halo always appeared around the observer's shadow. "I suppose you're the final proof that Nia blood has nothing to do with it," Sando mused. "That's assuming I'm telling you the truth, and I really can see it around my own head." "And assuming," Sando added, "that the Nia really did stay at home, and didn't wander around the galaxy spreading their progeny." They came over the top of the hill and looked down into the adjoining riverine valley. The sparse brown grass of the hillside gave way to a lush violet growth closer to the water. Joan's arrival had delayed the flooding of the valley, but even alien interest in the Nia had only bought the archaeologist an extra year. The dam was part of a long-planned agricultural development, and however tantalizing the possibility that Joan might reveal some priceless insight hidden among the Nia's useless abstractions, that vague promise could only compete with more tangible considerations for a limited time. Part of the hill had fallen away in a landslide a few centuries before, revealing more than a dozen beautifully preserved strata. When Joan and Sando reached the excavation site, Raleigh and Surat were already at work, clearing away soft sedimentary rock from a layer that Sando had dated as belonging to the Nia's Twilight period. Pirret had insisted that only Sando, the senior archaeologist, be told about Joan's true nature. Joan refused to lie to anyone, but had agreed to tell her colleagues only that she was a mathematician and that she was not permitted to discuss her past. At first this had made them guarded and resentful, no doubt because they assumed that she was some kind of spy sent by the authorities to watch over them. Later it had dawned on them that she was genuinely interested in their work, and that the absurd restrictions on her topics of conversation were not of her own choosing. Nothing about the Nuda's language or appearance correlated strongly with their recent division into nations. With no oceans to cross and a long history of migration, they were more or less geographically homogeneous. But Joan's odd name and occasional faux pas could still be ascribed to some mysterious exoticism. Raleigh and Surat seemed content to assume that she was a defector from one of the smaller nations, and that her history could not be made explicit for obscure political reasons.
"There are more tablets here, very close to the surface," Raleigh announced excitedly. "The acoustics are unmistakable."
Ideally, they would have excavated the entire hillside, but they did not have time or the labor, so they were using acoustic tomography to identify likely deposits of accessible Nia writing, and then concentrating their efforts on those spots. The Nia had probably had several ephemeral forms of written communication, but when they found something worth publishing, it stayed published. They carved their symbols into a ceramic that made diamond seem like tissue paper. It was almost unheard of for the tablets to be broken, but they were small, and multi-tablet works were sometimes widely dispersed. Nia technology could probably have carved 3 million years worth of knowledge onto the head of a pin. They seemed not to have invented nanomachines, but they were into high there's a there's a line break that's throwing me. Disadvantages of doing this live is you see me as I struggle. Hear me as I struggle, rather. You won't see me. I will not be showing a camera of my face doing this anytime soon. Nia technology could probably have carved 3 million years worth of knowledge onto the head of a pin. They seemed not to have invented nanomachines, but they were into high quality bulk materials and precision engineering. But for whatever reason, they had chosen legibility to the naked eye above other considerations. Joan made herself useful, taking acoustic readings further along the slope, while Sando watched over his students as they came closer to the buried Nia artifacts. She had learned not to hover around expectantly when a discovery was imminent. She was treated far more warmly if she waited to be summoned. The tomography unit was almost foolproof, using satellite navigation to track its position and software to analyze the signals it gathered. All it really needed was someone to drag it along the rock face at a suitable pace. Through the corner of her eye, Joan noticed her shadow on the rocks flicker and grow complicated. She looked up to see 3 dazzling beads of light flying west out of the sun. She might have assumed that the fusion ships were doing something useful, but the media was full of talk of military exercises, which meant the Tyrans and the Gahari engaging in expensive, belligerent gestures in orbit, trying to convince each other of their superior skills, technology, or sheer strength of numbers. For people with no real differences apart from a few centuries of recent history, they could puff up their minor political disputes into matters of the utmost solemnity. It might almost have been funny if the idiots hadn't incinerated hundreds of thousands of each other's citizens every few decades, not to mention playing callous and often deadly games with the lives of the inhabitants of smaller nations. Joan, Joan, come and look at this. Surat called to her. Oh, wait, Surat's the deep-voiced one. Joan switched off the tomography unit and jogged toward the archaeologists, suddenly conscious of her body's strangeness. Her legs were stumpy but strong, and her balance as she ran came not from arms and shoulders, but from the swish of her muscular tail.
It's a significant mathematical result, Raleigh informed her proudly when she reached them.
He'd pressure washed the sandstone away from the near indestructible ceramic of the tablet, and it was only a matter of holding the surface at the right angle to the light to see the etched writing stand out as crisply and starkly as it would have 1 million years before. Raleigh was not a mathematician, and he was not offering his own opinion on the theorem the tablet stated. The Nia themselves had a clear set of typographical conventions which they used to distinguish between everything from minor lemmas to the most celebrated theorems. The size and decorations of the symbols labeling the theorem attested to its value in the Nia's eyes. Joan read the theorem carefully. The proof was not included on the same tablet, but the Nia had a way of expressing their results that made you believe them as soon as you read them. In this case, the definitions of the terms needed to state the theorem were so beautifully chosen that the result seemed almost inevitable. The theorem itself was expressed as a commuting hypercube, one of the Nia's favorite forms. You could think of a square with 4 different sets of mathematical objects associated with each of its corners, and a way of mapping one set into another associated with each edge of the square. If the maps commuted, then going across the top of the square, then down, had exactly the same effect as going down the left edge of the square, then across. Either way, you mapped each element from the top left set from the top left set into the same element of the bottom right set. Oh. Either way, you mapped each element from the top left set into the same element of the bottom right set. A similar kind of result might hold for sets and maps that could naturally be placed at the corners and edges of a cube, or a hypercube of any dimension. It was also possible for the square faces in these structures to stand for relationships that held between the maps between sets, and for cubes to describe relationships between those relationships, and so on. That a theorem took this form didn't guarantee its importance. It was easy to cook up trivial examples of sets and maps that commuted. The Nia didn't carve trivia into their timeless ceramic, though, and this theorem was no exception. The seven-dimensional commuting hypercube established a dazzlingly elegant correspondence between seven distinct major branches of Nia mathematics, intertwining their most important concepts into a unified whole. It was a result Joan had never seen before. No mathematician anywhere in the amalgam, or in any ancestral culture she had studied, had reached the same insight. She explained as much of this as she could to the three archaeologists. They couldn't take in all the details, but their faces became orange with fascination when she sketched what she thought the result would have meant to the Nia themselves.
This isn't quite the big crunch, she joked, but it must have made them think they were getting closer.
The Big Crunch was her nickname for the mythical result that the Nia had aspired to reach, a unification of every field of mathematics that they considered significant. To find such a thing would not have meant the end of mathematics. It would not have subsumed every last conceivable interesting mathematical truth. But it would certainly have marked a point of closure for the Nia's own style of investigation. "I'm sure they found it," Surat insisted. "They reached the Big Crunch. Then they had nothing more to live for." Raleigh was scathing.
So the whole culture committed collective suicide?
"Not actively, no," Surat replied, "but it was the search that had kept them going."
Entire cultures don't lose their will to live, Raleigh said. They get wiped out by external forces, disease, invasion, changes in climate.
"The Nia survived for 3 million years," Surat countered. "They had the means to weather all of those forces. Unless they were wiped out by alien invaders with vastly superior technology." She turned to Joan. "What do you think?"
About aliens destroying the Nia?
"I was joking about the aliens. But what about the mathematics? What if they found the Big Crunch?"
There's more to life than mathematics, Joan said, but not much more.
Sando said,
And there's more to this find than one tablet. If we get back to work, we might have the proof in our hands before sunset.
Chapter 5. Joan briefed Halzoon by video link, while Sando prepared the. Oh my god, if this stupid thing doesn't get out of my freaking way. Sorry. Chapter 5. Joan briefed Halzoon by the video link, while Sando prepared the evening meal. Halzoon was the mathematician Pirate had appointed to supervise her, but apparently his day job was far too important to allow him to travel. Joan was grateful. Halzoon was the most tedious Nuda she had ever encountered. He could understand the Nia's work when she explained it to him, but he seemed to have no interest in it for its own sake. He spent most of their conversations trying to catch her out in some deception or contradiction, and the rest pressing her to imagine military or commercial applications of the Nia's gloriously useless insights. Sometimes she played along with this infantile fantasy, hinting at potential superweapons based on exotic physics that might come tumbling out of the vacuum, if only one possessed the right Nia theorems to coax them into existence. Sando was her minder too, but at least he was more subtle about it. Pirret had insisted that she stay in his shelter rather than sharing Raleigh and Surat's. Joan didn't mind, because with Sando she didn't have the stress of having to keep quiet about everything. Privacy and modesty were non-issues for the Nuda, and Joan had become Nuda enough not to care herself. Nor was there any danger of their proximity leading to a sexual bond. The Nuda had a complex system of biochemical cues that meant desire only arose in couples with a suitable mixture of genetic differences and similarities. She would have had to search a crowded Nuda city for a week to find someone to lust after, though at least it would have been guaranteed to be mutual. After they'd eaten, Sando said,
You should be happy. That was our best find yet. I am happy.
Joan made a conscious effort to exhibit a viridian tinge.
It was the first new result I've seen on this planet. It was the reason I came here, the reason I traveled so far. Something's wrong, though, I think. I wish I could have shared the news with my friend, Joan admitted.
Pirret claimed to be negotiating with the Tyrans to allow Anne to communicate with her, but Joan was not convinced that he was genuinely trying. She was sure that he would have relished the thought of listening in on a conversation between the two of them, while forcing them to speak Nuda, of course, in the hope that they'd slip up and reveal something useful, but at the same time he would have had to face the fact that the Tyrans would be listening too. What an excruciating dilemma.
You should have brought a communications link with you, Sando suggested. A home-style one, I mean. Nothing we could eavesdrop on. We couldn't do that, Joan said. He pondered this. You really are afraid of us, aren't you? You think the smallest technological trinket will be enough to send us straight to the stars, and then you'll have a horde of rampaging barbarians to deal with. We know how to deal with barbarians, Joan said coolly.
Sando's face grew dark with mirth.
Now I'm afraid. I just wish I knew what was happening to her, Joan said. What she was doing, how they were treating her. Probably much the same as we're treating you, Sando suggested. We're really not that different.
He thought for a moment.
There was something I wanted to show you.
He brought over his portable console and summoned up an article from a Tyran journal.
See what a borderless world we live in, he joked.
The article was entitled, Seekers and Spreaders, What We Must Learn from the Nia.
Sando said, This might give you some idea of how they're thinking over there. Jakad is an academic archaeologist, but she's also very close to the people in power.
Joan read from the console while Sando made repairs to their shelter, secreting a molasses-like substance from a gland at the tip of his tail and spreading it over the cracks in the walls. There were two main routes a culture could take, Jakad argued, once it satisfied its basic material needs. One was to think and study, to stand back and observe, to seek knowledge and insight from the world around it. The other was to invest its energy in entrenching its good fortune. The Nia had learned a great deal in 3 million years, but in the end it had not been enough to save them. Exactly what had killed them was still a matter of speculation, but it was hard to believe that if they had colonized other worlds, they would have vanished on all of them.
Had the Nia been spreaders, Jakad wrote, we might expect a visit from them, or them from us, sometime in the coming centuries.
The Nuda, in contrast, were determined spreaders. Once they had the means, they would plant colonies across the galaxy. They would, Jakad was sure, create new biospheres, re-engineer stars, and even alter space and time to guarantee their survival. The growth of their empire would come first. Any knowledge that failed to serve that purpose would be a mere distraction.
In any competition between seekers and spreaders, it is a law of history that the spreaders must win out in the end. Seekers, such as the Nia, might hog resources and block the way, but in the long run their own nature will be their downfall.
Joan stopped reading.
When you look out into the galaxy with your telescopes, she asked Sando, how many re-engineered stars do you see? Would we recognize them? Yes. Natural stellar processes aren't that complicated. Your scientists already know everything there is to know about the subject. I'll take your word for that. So you're saying Jakad is wrong? The Nia themselves never left this world, but the galaxy already belongs to creature more like them than us? Belongs to creatures more like them than us? It's not Nuda versus Nia, Jones said. It's a matter of how cultures. Oh my god. Skip one word and you throw everything off, Frag. I knew this. It's not Nuda versus Nia, Jones said. It's a matter of how a culture's perspective changes with time. Once a species conquers disease, modifies their biology, and spreads even a short distance beyond their homeworld, they usually start to relax a bit. The territorial imperative isn't some timeless law of history. It belongs to a certain phase. What if it persists, though, into a later phase? That can cause friction, Joan admitted. Nevertheless, no spreaders have conquered the galaxy. Not yet.
Sando went back to his repairs. Joan read the rest of the article. She'd thought she'd already grasped the lesson demanded by the subtitle, but it turned out that. Oh, let's put the right emphasis on the correct syllable. Joan read the rest of the article. She'd thought she'd already grasped the lesson demanded by the subtitle, but it turned out that Jakad had something more specific in mind.
Having argued this way, how can I defend my own field of study from the very same charges I have brought against the Nia? Having grasped the essential character of this doomed race, why should we waste our time and resources studying them further? The answer is simple. We still do not know exactly how and why the Nia died, but when we do, that could turn out to be the most important discovery in history. When we finally leave our world behind, we should not expect to find only other spreaders to compete with us as honorable opponents in battle. There will be seekers as well, blocking the way, tired old races squatting uselessly on their hoards of knowledge and wealth. Time will defeat them in the end, but we already waited 3 million years to be born. We should have no patience to wait again. If we can learn how the Nia died, that will be our key. That will be our weapon. If we know the Seeker's weakness, we can find a way to hasten their demise.
Chapter 6. The proof of the Nia's theorem turned out to be buried deep in the hillside, but over the following days they extracted it all. It was as beautiful and satisfying as Joan could have wished, merging 6 earlier, simpler theorems while extending the techniques used in their proofs. She could even see hints at how the same methods might be stretched further to yield still stronger results. The Big Crunch had always been a slightly mocking, irreverent term, but now she was struck anew by how little justice it did to the real trend that had fascinated the Nia. It was not a matter of everything in mathematics collapsing in on itself, with one branch turning out to have been merely a recapitulation of another under a different guise. Rather, the principle was that every sufficiently beautiful mathematical system was rich enough to mirror in part, and sometimes in a complex and distorted fashion, every other sufficiently beautiful system. Nothing became sterile and redundant. Nothing proved to have been a waste of time, but everything was shown to be magnificently intertwined. After briefing Haljan, Joan used the satellite dish to transmit the theorem and its proof to the decoy node. That had been the deal with Pirate. Anything she learned from the Nia belonged to the whole galaxy, as long as she explained it to her hosts first. The archaeologists moved across the hillside, hunting for more artifacts in that same layer of sediment. In the same layer of sediment, sorry. Joan was eager to see what else the same group of Nia might have published. One possible 8-dimensional hypercube was hovering in her mind. If she'd sat down and thought about it for a few decades, she might have worked out the details herself. But the Nia did what they did so well that it would have seemed crass to try to follow clumsily in their footsteps when their own immaculately polished results might simply be lying in the ground, waiting to be uncovered. A month after the discovery, Joan was woken by the sound of an intruder moving through the shelter. She knew it wasn't Sando. Even as she slept, an ancient part of her Nuda brain was listening to his heartbeat. The stranger's heart was too quiet to hear, which required great discipline, but the shelter's flexible adhesive made the floor emit a characteristic squeak beneath even the gentlest footsteps. As she rose from her crouch, she heard Sando waking, and she turned in his direction. Bright torchlight on his face dazzled her for a moment. The intruder held 2 knives to Sando's respiratory membranes. A deep enough cut there would mean choking to death in excruciating pain. The nanomachines that had built Joan's body had wired extensive skills in unarmed combat into her brain, and one scenario involving a feigned escape attempt followed by a sideways flick of her powerful tail was already playing out in the back of her mind, but as yet she could see no way to guarantee that Sando came through it all unharmed. She said,
What do you want?
The intruder remained in darkness.
Tell me about the ship that brought you to Bunath.
Why?
Because it would be a shame to shred your colleague here just when his work was going so well.
Sando refused to show any emotion on his face, but the blank pallor itself was as stark an expression of fear as anything Joan could imagine.
She said, There's a coherent state that can be prepared for a quark-gluon plasma in which virtual black holes catalyze baryon decay. In effect, you can turn all of your fuel's rest mass into photons, yielding the most efficient exhaust stream possible.
She recited a long list of technical details. The claimed baryon decay process didn't actually exist, but the pseudo-physics underpinning it was mathematically consistent, and could not be ruled out by anything the Nuda had yet observed. She and Anne had prepared an entire fictitious science and technology, and even a fictitious history of their culture, precisely for emergencies like this. They could spout red herrings for a decade, if necessary, and never get caught out contradicting themselves.
That wasn't so hard, was it?
The intruder gloated.
What now?
You're going to take a trip with me. If you do this nicely, nobody needs to get hurt.
Something moved in the shadows, and the intruder screamed in pain. Joan leaped forward and knocked one of the knives out of his hand with her tail. The other knife grazed Sando's membrane, but a second tail whipped out of the darkness and intervened. As the intruder fell backward, the beam of his torch revealed Surat and Raleigh, tensed beside him, and a pick buried deep in his side. Joan's rush of combat hormones suddenly faded, and she let out a long, deep wail of anguish. Sando was unscathed, but a stream of dark liquid was pumping out of the intruder's wound. Surat was annoyed. "Stop blubbing and help us tie up this Tyran cousin fucker."
Tie him up? You've killed him!
"Don't be stupid. That's just sheath fluid." Joan recalled her Nuda anatomy. Sheath fluid was like oil in a hydraulic machine. You could lose it all, and it would cost you most of the strength in your limbs and tail, but you wouldn't die, and your body would make more eventually. Raleigh found some cable, and they trussed up the intruder. Sando was shaken, but he seemed to be recovering. He took Joan aside.
I'm going to have to call Pirate. I understand, but what will she do to these two?
She wasn't sure exactly how much Raleigh and Surat had heard, but it was certain to have been more than Pirate wanted them to know.
Don't worry about that. I can protect them.
Just before dawn, someone sent by Pirret arrived in a truck to take the intruder away. Sando declared a rest day, and Raleigh and Surat went back to their shelter to sleep. Joan went for a walk along the hillside. She didn't feel like sleeping. Sando caught up with her. He said,
I told them you'd been working on a military research project, and you were exiled here for some political misdemeanor.
And they believed you?
All they heard was half of a conversation full of incomprehensible physics. All they know is that someone thought you were worth kidnapping.
Joan said, I'm sorry about what happened.
Sando hesitated.
What did you expect?
Joan was stung.
One of us went to Tira, one of us came here. We thought that would keep everyone happy.
We're spreaders, said Sando. Give us one of anything and we want two, especially if our enemy has the other one. Did you really think you could come here, do a bit of fossicking, and then simply fly away without changing a thing?
Your culture has always believed there were other civilizations in the galaxy. Our existence hardly came as a shock.
Sando's face became yellow, an expression of almost parental reproach.
Believing in something in the abstract is not the same as having it dangled in front of you. We were never going to have an existential crisis at finding out that we're not unique. The Nia might be related to us, but they were still just alien enough to get us used to the idea. But did you really think we were just going to relax and accept your refusal to share your technology? That one of you went to the Tyrans only makes it worse for the Gahari, and vice versa. Both governments are going absolutely crazy, each one terrified that the other has found a way to make its alien talk.
Joan stopped walking.
The war games, the border skirmishes, you're blaming all of that on Anne and me?
Sando's body sagged wearily.
To be honest, I don't know all the details. If it's any consolation, I'm sure we would have found another reason if you hadn't come along.
Joan said,
Maybe I should leave.
She was tired of these people, tired of her body, tired of being cut off from civilization. She had rescued one beautiful Nia theorem and sent it out into the amalgam. Wasn't that enough?
It's up to you, Sando replied, but you might as well stay until they flood the valley. Another year isn't going to change anything. What you've done to this world has already been done. For us, there's no going back.
Chapter 7. Joan stayed with the archaeologists as they moved across the hillside. They found tablets bearing Naya drawings and poetry, which no doubt had their virtues, but to Joan seemed bland and opaque. Sando and his students relished these discoveries as much as the theorems. To them, the Nia culture was a vast jigsaw puzzle, and any clue that filled in the details of their history was as good as any other. Sando would have told Pirret everything he'd heard from Joan the night the intruder came, so she was surprised that she hadn't been summoned for a fresh interrogation to flesh out the details. Perhaps the Gahari physicists were still digesting her elaborate gobbledygook, trying to decide if it made sense. In her more cynical moments, she wondered if the intruder might have been Gahari himself, sent by Pirret to exploit her friendship with Sando. Perhaps Sando had even been in on it, and Raleigh and Surat as well. The possibility made her feel as if she was living in a fabricated world, a scape in which nothing was real and nobody could be trusted. The only thing she was certain that the Gaharis could not have faked was the Naya artifacts. The mathematics verified itself. Everything else was subject to doubt and paranoia. Summer came, burning away the morning fogs. The Nuda's idea of heat was very different from Joan's previous perceptions, but even the body she now wore found the midday sun oppressive. She willed herself to be patient. There was still a chance that the Nia had taken a few more steps toward their grand vision of a unified mathematics, and carved their final discoveries into the form that would outlive them by 1,000,000 years. When the lone fusion ship appeared high in the afternoon sky, Joan resolved to ignore it. She glanced up once, but she kept dragging the tomography unit across the ground. She was sick of thinking about Tiran Gahari politics. They had played their childish games for centuries. She would not take the blame for this latest outbreak of provocation. Usually, the ships flew by, disappearing within minutes, showing off their power and speed. This one lingered, weaving back and forth across the sky, like some dazzling insect performing an elaborate mating dance. Joan's second shadow darted around her feet, hammering a strangely familiar rhythm into her brain. She looked up, disbelieving. The motion of the ship was following the syntax of a gestural language she had learned on another planet, in another body, a dozen lifetimes ago. The only other person on this world who could know that language was Anne. She glanced toward the archaeologists 100 meters away, but they seemed to be paying no attention to the ship. She switched off the tomography unit and stared into the sky.
I'm listening, friend. What's happening? Did they give you back your ship? Have you had enough of this world and decided to go home?
Anne told the story in shorthand, compressed and elliptic. The Tirans had found a tablet bearing a theorem, the last of the Nia's discoveries, the pinnacle of their achievements. Her minders had not let her study it, but they had contrived a situation making it easy for her to steal it, and to steal this ship. They had wanted her to take it and run, in the hope that she would lead them to something they valued far more than any ancient mathematics, an advanced spacecraft, or some magical stargate at the edge of the system. But Anne wasn't fleeing anywhere. She was high above Gahar, reading the tablet, and now she would paint what she read across the sky for Joan to see. Sando approached.
We're in danger. We have to move. Danger? That's my friend up there. She's not going to shoot a missile at us.
Your friend? Sando seemed confused. As he spoke, 3 more ships came into view, lower and brighter than the first.
I've been told that the Tirans are going to strike the valley to bury the Nia sites. We need to get over the hill and indoors to get some protection from the blast. Why would the Tirans attack the Nia sites? That makes no sense to me.
Sando said,
Nor me, but I don't have time to argue.
The 3 ships were menacing Anne's, pursuing her, trying to drive her away. Joan had no idea if they were Gahari defending their territory, or Tirans harassing her in the hope that she would flee and reveal the non-existent shortcut to the stars. But Anne was staying put, still weaving the same gestural language into her maneuvers even as she dodged her pursuers, spelling out the Nia's glorious finale.
Joan said, You go. I have to see this.
She tensed, ready to fight him if necessary. Sando took something from his tool belt and peppered her side with holes. Joan gasped with pain and crumpled to the ground as the sheath fluid poured out of her. Raleigh and Surat helped carry her to the shelter. Joan caught glimpses of the fiery ballet in the sky, but not enough to make sense of it, let alone reconstruct it. They put her on her couch inside the shelter. Sando bandaged her side and gave her water to sip. He said,
I'm sorry I had to do that, but if anything had happened to you, I would have been held responsible.
Surat kept ducking outside to check on the battle, then reporting excitedly on the state of play. The Tirans still up there. They still can't get rid of it. I don't know why they haven't shut it down yet.
Because the Tirans were the ones pursuing Anne, and they didn't want her dead. But for how long would the Gahari tolerate this violation?
Anne's efforts could not be allowed to come to nothing. Joan struggled to recall the constellations she'd last seen in the night sky. At the node they'd departed from, powerful telescopes were constantly trained on the Nuda's home world. Anne's ship was easily bright enough, its gestures wide enough, to be resolved from 7 light-years away, if the planet itself wasn't blocking the view, if the node was above the horizon. The shelter was windowless, but Joan saw the ground outside the doorway brighten for an instant. The flash was silent. No missile had struck the valley. The explosion had taken place high above the atmosphere. Surat went outside. When she returned, she said quietly, "All clear. They got it." Joan put all her effort into spitting out a handful of words.
I want to see what happened.
Sando hesitated, then motioned the others to help him pick up the couch and carry it outside. A shell of glowing plasma was still visible, drifting across the sky as it expanded, a ring of light growing steadily fainter until it vanished into the afternoon glare. Anne was dead in this embodiment, but her backup would wake and go on to new adventures. Joan could at least tell her the story of her local death, of virtuoso flying, and a spectacular end. She'd recovered her bearings now, and she recalled the position of the stars. The node was still hours away from rising. The amalgam was full of powerful telescopes, but no others would be aimed at this obscure planet, and no plea to redirect them could outrace the light they would need to capture in order to bring the Nia's final theorem back to life. Chapter 8. Sando wanted to send her away for medical supervision, but Joan insisted on remaining at the site.
The fewer officials who get to know about this incident, the fewer problems it makes for you, she reasoned. As long as you don't get sick and die, he replied. I'm not going to die.
Her wounds had not become infected, and her strength was returning rapidly. They compromised. Sando hired someone to drive up from the nearest town to look after her while he was out at the excavation. Daya had basic medical training and didn't ask awkward questions. He seemed happy to tend to Joan's needs, and then lie outside daydreaming the rest of the time. There was still a chance, Joan thought, that the Nia had carved the theorem on a multitude of tablets and scattered them all over the planet. There was also a chance that the Tyrans had made copies of the tablet before letting Anne abscond with it. The question, though, was whether she had the slightest prospect of getting her hands on these duplicates. Anne might have had some kind of copy herself, but she hadn't mentioned it in the prologue to her aerobatic rendition of the theorem. If she'd had any time to spare, she wouldn't have limited herself to an audience of one. She would have waited until the node had risen over Gahar. On her second night as an invalid, Joan dreamed that she saw Anne standing on the hill looking back into the fog-shrouded valley, her shadow haloed by the Nia light. When she woke, she knew what she had to do. When Sando left, she asked Daya to bring her the console that controlled the satellite dish. She had enough strength in her arms now to operate it, and Daya showed no interest in what she did. That was naive, of course. Whether or not Daya was spying on her, Pirate would know exactly where the signal was sent. So be it. 7 light-years was still far beyond the Nuda's reach. The whole node could be disassembled and erased long before they came close. No message could outrace light directly, but there were more ways for light to reach the node than the direct path, the fastest one. Every black hole had its glory, twisting light around it in a tight, close orbit and flinging it back out again. 74 hours after the original image was lost to them, the telescopes at the node could still turn to the cataract and scour the distorted, compressed image of the sky at the rim of the hole's black disk to catch a replay of Anne's ballet. Joan composed the message and entered the coordinates of the node.
You didn't die for nothing, my friend. When you wake and see this, you'll be proud of us both.
She hesitated, her hand hovering above the send key. The Tyrans had wanted Anne to flee, to show them the way to the stars, but had they really been indifferent to the loot they'd let her carry? The theorem had come at the end of the Nia's 3 million-year reign. To witness this beautiful truth would not destroy the amalgam, but might it not weaken it? If the seekers' thirst for knowledge was slaked, their sense of purpose corroded, might not the most crucial strand of the culture fall into a twilight of its own? There was no shortcut to the stars, but the Nuda had been goaded by their alien visitors, and the technology would come to them soon enough. The amalgam had been goaded too. The theorem she'd already transmitted would send a wave of excitement around the galaxy, strengthening the seekers, encouraging them to complete the unification by their own efforts. The big crunch might be inevitable, but at least she could delay it, and hope that the robustness and diversity of the amalgam would carry them through it, and beyond. She erased the message and wrote a new one, addressed to her backup via the decoy node. It would have been nice to upload all her memories, but the Nuda were ruthless, and she wasn't prepared to stay any longer and risk being used by them. This sketch, this postcard, would have to be enough. When the transmission was complete, she left a note for Sando in the console's memory. Dia called out to her.
Joan, do you need anything?
She said,
No, I'm going to sleep for a while.
and that was Glory by Greg Egan. Alrighty. And with that, I got a dip. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you didn't tune in while it was live and you were listening to it after the fact, well, hey, guess what? I do these live. Hence why their quality is so dodgy, and hence why I sound like I've got a completely plugged nose right now. Because of a weather shift.
I can't always be at my best, damn it, but I try.
The best is yet to come, and baby, I feel clogged. Anyway, with that, I got a dip. Other than next week, the week of November the the week of the 13th, well, week of the 17th, I will not be around. So that entire November 17th, 2023, I won't be around. So there will be a delay, a pause, a moratorium. I won't be around. I will not have time, and I will not be around. So we will resume then on the 24th. I usually start at around 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, East Coast U.S. time. Sometimes I'm a few minutes late, so be patient. Thanks. And yeah, that's about it. Otherwise, you're probably listening to this via the live streamed recording on YouTube, in which case, cool. That reminds me, I really need to back up most of my videos for like the last year and a half, because I have not done that. For a year and a half, I need to do that. So I'll probably have to get around to that sometime in the near future, by the end of the year. So yeah, as I was muttering earlier, way back at the beginning of this stream a couple hours ago, should still be done this before the end of December. So we should be getting onto the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons, not Dave Simmons, Dan Simmons, by Dan Simmons sometime before the end of the year. How long that's going to take to get through, and after that, and I can move on to other books, I don't know. It's a long book, so it could be quite a while. It's actually 2 books, but we'll probably wind up doing both of them. It's going to be quite a while. Um, after that, after Hyperion, probably I forget which was higher on the priority tree because I don't have it written down. I'm pretty sure it was the 3-body problem was the next one. Or was it Destination Void? It might have been Destination Void. Either way, it's either the 3-body problem by Xixin Liu, which I'm probably mispronouncing and mangling, or Destination Void by the one, the only, the man, the myth, and the legend, Frank Herbert. Um, there's a third one. What's the third one? Somebody wanted a third thing, and I don't remember what it was. Why don't I remember? I'll remember eventually. I'll wake up screaming its name in the middle of the night. Anyway, that's the mid to long term plan. With that, I gotta go. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, stay tame, stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool based on your personal preference, and be decent to each other. Alrighty, until next time, bye bye.